Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky stares directly into the camera in a photograph taken sometime in the late 1950s. His Soviet military uniform pressed to perfection, his chest adorned with medals earned during the Great Patriotic War. His face is broad, almost gentle, with the kind of features that might belong to a village school teacher rather than a colonel in military intelligence. But look closer at those eyes. There is something restless there, something that does not quite match the official portrait of a loyal Soviet officer. A flicker of calculation, perhaps, or desperation. Within a few years of this photograph being taken, this unassuming man would hold the fate of the entire world in his hands. Moscow in 1960 was a city of contradictions. The Stalinist terror had receded, replaced by Khrushchev's uneasy thaw, but fear still moved through the streets like winter fog. At diplomatic receptions in the grand halls of the Soviet capital, champagne flowed freely, and the enemies of yesterday clinked glasses with careful smiles. It was at one such reception that Penkovsky found himself standing at the edge of the room, watching American and British officials laugh together as if the Cold War were merely a disagreement between old friends. He had come to these events before, always with the same purpose burning beneath his calm exterior. He needed to speak to someone from the West. He needed them to listen. But they never did. 4 times already, Oleg Penkovsky had attempted to make contact with Western intelligence. He approached American tourists on the streets of Moscow, pressing notes into their startled hands. He sought out businessmen visiting from London, trying to explain who he was, what he could offer. Each time, he was met with suspicion, confusion, or polite dismissal. The letters he entrusted to these unwitting couriers either never arrived or were ignored entirely. At CIA headquarters in Langley and MI6 offices in London, analysts glanced at his overtures and shook their heads. It was too obvious, too easy. A decorated colonel with access to the highest military secrets simply volunteering to betray his country? The trap could not have been more transparent if it had been wrapped in red ribbon. And perhaps they were right to be cautious. The intelligence world of 1960 was a labyrinth of mirrors where nothing was as it seemed. Soviet deception operations had burned Western agencies before, luring them with false defectors who fed back disinformation while identifying the officers foolish enough to take the bait. Penkovsky's credentials were almost too perfect. His father had fought for the White Army during the Civil War, a stain that should have ended his career, yet somehow he had risen through the ranks of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. He had served as a senior liaison to foreign military delegations. He had access to missile specifications, strategic doctrine, the names and faces of intelligence officers stationed across Europe. No genuine traitor would be allowed to accumulate such knowledge, unless, of course, someone wanted him to. The question that historians still debate decades later is simple but unsettling. Why did it take so long for the West to accept Penkovsky's offer? Was it merely bureaucratic caution, the reasonable skepticism of agencies that had been fooled before? Or was there something else at work, someone inside Western intelligence who did not want this particular Soviet colonel to be heard? The timing of those rejections, the pattern of missed connections and ignored messages, begins to look less like coincidence when examined closely. Penkovsky himself seemed to sense that invisible forces were working against him. In later debriefings, he would speak of feeling watched, of suspecting that his own people knew more about his intentions than they should. But in 1960, he had no proof. Only the maddening certainty that he possessed secrets that could change everything, and no one willing to receive them. So he waited. He attended more receptions, smiled at more diplomats, and searched for another way through the wall that separated him from the West. Somewhere in the fog of espionage and counter-espionage, a door would eventually open. But even Penkovsky could not have known how high the stakes would become, or how little time remained before the world would need the secrets he carried. The clock was already ticking toward a crisis that would bring humanity to the edge of annihilation, and the man who might prevent it was still a ghost in the shadows, desperate to be believed. The man who finally opened the door was not a spy, or at least that is what he would claim for the rest of his life. Greville Maynard Wynne was a British businessman in his early 40s, a salesman of industrial equipment who had built a modest career traveling to trade fairs across Eastern Europe. He was balding, affable, and thoroughly unremarkable, exactly the sort of person who could move through Soviet checkpoints without attracting a second glance. In April of 1961, Wynne arrived in Moscow as part of a British trade delegation, carrying samples of electrical machinery and, perhaps, something far more dangerous. Within days, he would become the critical link in one of the most important espionage operations of the Cold War. The meeting took place in a Moscow hotel room, the heavy curtains drawn against the pale spring light. Penkovsky had been waiting for this moment for nearly 2 years, and now it had finally arrived. MI6, after months of internal debate, had decided to take a chance on the persistent Soviet colonel. They couldn't send a professional intelligence officer. Such a person would be watched from the moment they stepped off the plane, so they chose Wynne instead. A businessman with legitimate reasons to be in Moscow. A man with no training in tradecraft, no experience in espionage, no idea what he was walking into. Or so he later insisted. The two men spoke in whispers, their conversation punctuated by long silences as they listened for footsteps in the corridor outside. Penkovsky handed over the first package that night, rolls of microfilm containing Soviet missile specifications, technical manuals, strategic assessments. The material was extraordinary. Western analysts had been struggling to understand Soviet nuclear capabilities for years, piecing together fragments from satellite photographs and intercepted communications. Now, suddenly, they had the blueprints themselves, delivered by a man who seemed almost eager to betray everything he knew. Wynne accepted the package without fully understanding its significance. He tucked it into his luggage, smiled his salesman's smile, and returned to London a few days later. The operation that would come to be known as one of the greatest intelligence coups in history had begun. But here is where the story becomes complicated. In the years after his release from Soviet prison, Greville Wynne wrote memoirs and gave interviews in which he portrayed himself as an innocent dupe, a patriotic Englishman who was gradually drawn into espionage without understanding the risks until it was too late. He claimed that MI6 had manipulated him, using his business trips as cover without his full knowledge or consent. It was a sympathetic narrative, and many people believed it. Yet declassified British documents tell a different story. According to MI6 records, Wynne was briefed extensively before his first trip to Moscow. He knew exactly what he was carrying and for whom. He was not a victim of circumstance, but a willing participant who understood the danger from the very beginning. Which version is true? The question matters more than it might seem.
If Wynne was genuinely unaware of his role, then MI6 was reckless beyond belief, entrusting the most sensitive intelligence operation of the decade to a man who did not know he was a spy. If he was fully briefed, then his later claims of innocence were deliberate lies, but lies told with the apparent blessing of British intelligence, who never publicly contradicted his version of events. Why would MI6 allow such ambiguity to persist? Some researchers have suggested that Wynne's false narrative served a purpose. It protected operational methods, obscured the involvement of other agents, and created a fog of confusion that benefited those who preferred certain truths to remain hidden. There is another possibility, darker and more troubling. What if neither Wynne nor MI6 was telling the complete truth? What if there were aspects of the Penkovsky operation that both sides agreed to conceal? Details so sensitive that even decades later they could not be revealed. The files that have been declassified are heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out or missing entirely. The full story of how Greville Wynne came to be standing in that Moscow hotel room accepting microfilm from a Soviet colonel may never be known. What is certain is that from that moment forward, both men were living on borrowed time. The KGB was patient, methodical, and very, very good at finding traitors. The clock had started ticking the moment Penkovsky handed over that first roll of film. 5,000 documents. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. Over the course of 18 months, Oleg Penkovsky photographed, copied, and smuggled more classified material to the West than any Soviet source before or since. He worked alone in his Moscow apartment, the curtains drawn, a miniature Minox camera no larger than a cigarette lighter clicking softly as he captured page after page of secrets. Missile specifications, nuclear warhead designs, the complete organizational structure of the GRU, the names, faces, and operational covers of Soviet intelligence officers stationed across Western Europe. Each roll of film was a death sentence waiting to be discovered, and Penkovsky produced them by the dozen. The tradecraft was elaborate and terrifyingly fragile. Dead drops in Moscow parks where Penkovsky would leave film canisters hidden behind loose bricks or tucked into the hollows of trees. Brush passes on crowded streets, a momentary collision between strangers that left packages transferred in the space of a heartbeat, and most crucially, the meetings abroad. Penkovsky's position allowed him to travel as part of Soviet trade delegations, and during these trips to London and Paris, he would spend hours with his British and American handlers debriefing in safe houses while armed guards watched the doors. The CIA and MI6 were running the operation jointly now, an unusual arrangement that reflected the extraordinary value of the intelligence Penkovsky was providing. But something was changing in the colonel. As the months passed and the pile of secrets grew higher, Penkovsky's behavior began to alarm the very people who depended on him. He grew bolder in his communications, taking risks that seemed unnecessary. He requested gifts that raised eyebrows. a British military uniform complete with the insignia of a colonel, as if he wished to see himself transformed into the Western officer he was secretly serving. He asked to meet the Queen. He spoke of being made an honorary member of the British establishment, of being recognized for the sacrifices he was making. His handlers exchanged worried glances. Vanity was dangerous in a spy. It made men careless. It made them forget that survival depended on invisibility. Some who studied the case later would offer a different interpretation. Perhaps Penkovsky was not losing his grip on reality, but rather preparing for an ending he could already see approaching. The uniform, the requests for recognition, the insistence on leaving a paper trail of his service to the West, these might have been the actions of a man creating evidence. If he were captured, if the KGB dragged him into a basement interrogation room, he would have nothing to show for his betrayal except memories that could be dismissed as fabrication. But a photograph of himself in British military dress? Documentation of his meetings with CIA officers? These were artifacts that could survive him, proof that he had acted not out of greed or weakness, but out of conviction. Breadcrumbs left for historians who might one day try to understand what he had done and why. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. Every morning, Penkovsky woke in Moscow and put on the uniform of a Soviet colonel. He attended meetings with men who would have shot him without hesitation if they knew the truth. He smiled at colleagues, discussed military strategy, played the role of a loyal officer while carrying enough secrets to destroy them all. And every night, he returned to his apartment, retrieved his hidden camera, and continued his solitary war against the system that had shaped his entire life. How long could any man sustain such a double existence? The handlers in London and Washington debated whether to extract him, to end the operation while there was still time. But the intelligence was too valuable. The risks were acceptable. And so Penkovsky continued, photographing documents, passing film, waiting for the knock on the door that he knew would eventually come. There are those who believe that Penkovsky's recklessness was not a flaw, but a choice. That he understood, with the clarity of a man who has already accepted his fate, that the operation could not last forever. The KGB was too thorough, too patient, too skilled at finding traitors in their midst. Sooner or later, they would discover the colonel who photographed secrets in his apartment. The only question was, what would remain when they did, and whether the world would remember the man who had risked everything to change it. October of 1962 began like any other autumn in Washington. The leaves turned gold along the Potomac, government workers hurried through their routines, and President John F. Kennedy prepared for the midterm elections that would define the second half of his administration. But in the basement offices of the CIA, where fluorescent lights buzzed over desks cluttered with satellite photographs, a nightmare was taking shape. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying high above Cuba had captured images that would bring the world closer to annihilation than it had ever been before. Soviet missile installations, partially hidden beneath camouflage netting, were rising from the Cuban soil. Nuclear weapons capable of reaching American cities in minutes were being assembled 90 miles from Florida. The photographs alone, however, were not enough. Aerial reconnaissance could show that something was being built, but interpreting what that something could do required knowledge that the United States simply did not possess. How powerful were these missiles? How long before they became operational? What was their range, their accuracy, their readiness for launch? These were not academic questions. President Kennedy needed answers within hours, not weeks, because the decisions he made in the coming days would determine whether millions of people lived or died. And this is where the story of Oleg Penkovsky intersects with the most dangerous moment in human history. The technical manuals he had smuggled to the West over the previous 18 months contained exactly the specifications American analysts needed. Without Penkovsky's intelligence, the CIA would have been guessing. Analysts would have stared at grainy photographs and offered estimates based on fragmentary data and educated assumptions. They might have overestimated Soviet capabilities, pushing Kennedy toward a preemptive strike that could have triggered nuclear retaliation. Or they might have underestimated the threat, allowing Khrushchev to complete his installations and present the world with a fait accompli. Instead, American intelligence knew precisely what they were looking at. They recognized the missile types, understood the assembly sequence, and could calculate almost to the hour when the weapons would become operational. This knowledge gave Kennedy something invaluable: time to negotiate. But here the narrative must pause to consider a question that has haunted historians for decades. Did Nikita Khrushchev know? The Soviet premier was a shrewd and experienced political survivor who had clawed his way to power through the brutal machinery of Stalinist politics. He understood espionage, understood that secrets were currency in the Cold War, understood that his enemies were constantly probing for weaknesses. Is it possible that he remained ignorant of the hemorrhage of classified material flowing from Moscow to Washington? Some scholars have pointed to Khrushchev's behavior during the crisis as evidence that he suspected his hand had been exposed. His willingness to back down, to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a face-saving agreement, seemed uncharacteristic for a man known for bluster and brinkmanship. Others argue the opposite, that Khrushchev's retreat was simply the rational calculation of a leader who recognized he had overplayed his position. The Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was far smaller than American intelligence had once feared, and Khrushchev knew that a direct confrontation would end in catastrophe for his country. He did not need to know about Penkovsky to understand that the missiles in Cuba were a gamble he could not win. The truth, as always, may lie somewhere in the shadows between these interpretations. Certain Soviet archives remain sealed to this day, their contents known only to a handful of officials who have never spoken publicly. What did Moscow know, and when did they know it? The question lingers like smoke over a battlefield. What is certain is that for 13 days in October, the world held its breath while two superpowers stared at each other across an abyss. And throughout those 13 days, the intelligence that Oleg Penkovsky had risked his life to deliver was shaping every American decision. The man who had once stood at the edge of diplomatic receptions, desperate to be heard, had finally made his voice carry to the highest levels of power. Whether Khrushchev understood this or not, the colonel from Moscow had become the invisible hand guiding humanity back from the brink of destruction. In the world of espionage, ghosts speak to ghosts across the decades. Oleg Gordievsky was 24 years old in 1962 a junior officer in the KGB who had only recently begun his career in Soviet intelligence. He was ambitious, idealistic in his own complicated way, and already nursing doubts about the system he served, doubts that would eventually lead him to become one of the most important Western assets of the Cold War's final chapter. But that betrayal lay more than 20 years in the future. In the autumn of 1962, Gordievsky was simply a young man with sharp ears and a talent for remembering whispers. And the whispers he heard that October would stay with him for the rest of his life. Something was wrong inside Soviet military intelligence. The KGB and the GRU existed in a state of perpetual rivalry, two predators circling each other within the same bureaucratic ecosystem, and rumors traveled between them like contagion. Gordievsky later recalled hearing fragments of conversation, oblique references to an investigation that had nothing to do with his own department, but seemed to consume the attention of senior officers. A mole, a traitor somewhere in the upper ranks of the GRU. The details were maddeningly vague, but the tension was unmistakable. Someone had been feeding secrets to the West, and the hunt was underway. What Gordievsky did not know, what almost no one outside a tiny circle of KGB counterintelligence officers knew, was that the traitor had already been identified. The question that has tormented historians ever since is brutally simple. When did the Soviets first suspect Oleg Penkovsky? The official timeline suggests that the KGB discovered his treachery in the autumn of 1962, almost simultaneously with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But official timelines in the intelligence world are constructed for purposes that have nothing to do with truth. Some accounts, drawn from defector testimony and fragmentary archival evidence, suggest that Penkovsky had been under surveillance for months before his arrest. KGB watchers had observed his meetings with Janet Chisholm in Moscow parks. They had tracked his movements during foreign trips. They had compiled a dossier thick with suspicion, waiting for the right moment to close the trap. If this is true, then the implications are staggering. It would mean that during the most dangerous 2 weeks in human history, as Kennedy and Khrushchev played their nuclear chess game, the Soviets knew that their secrets were flowing to Washington. Every piece of intelligence Penkovsky delivered during that period would have been suspect, potentially poisoned with disinformation designed to mislead American decision-makers at the moment when accurate information mattered most. Did Khrushchev allow the operation to continue precisely because he could control what the Americans learned? Was the Cuban Missile Crisis itself shaped by a Soviet deception that historians have never fully understood? The possibility hangs over the historical record like a shadow that refuses to fade. Other researchers reject this interpretation entirely. They point to evidence suggesting that the KGB stumbled onto Penkovsky almost by accident, through routine surveillance of Greville, Wynne, rather than any sophisticated counterintelligence operation. In this version, Soviet security services were as surprised as anyone when they discovered the scope of the colonel's betrayal. The timing of the arrest, just as the Cuban crisis reached its peak, was coincidence, not design. But coincidences of such magnitude are difficult to accept, and the KGB was not an organization known for accidents. The files that might settle the question remained locked in Russian archives, accessible only to those with the authority to keep secrets buried. There is one more possibility, rarely discussed, but impossible to dismiss. What if the leak came not from Soviet counterintelligence, but from somewhere inside the Western agencies that Penkovsky served? The CIA and MI6 were not immune to penetration. Kim Philby had proven that just years earlier, and other moles would be discovered in the decades to come. If someone in London or Washington had betrayed Penkovsky, the consequences would have been catastrophic, not just for the colonel himself, but for every operation he had touched. Such a breach would explain much: the timing of the Soviet response, the ambiguities in the historical record, the stubborn refusal of certain files to see the light of day. But naming shadows is a dangerous game, and the ghost behind Oleg Penkovsky has never been definitively identified. She walked through Tsvetnoy Boulevard with a baby carriage, her children playing nearby, looking for all the world like any other diplomatic wife enjoying a Moscow afternoon. Janet Chisholm was 30 years old, the mother of 3 young children and the spouse of a British embassy official named Rory Chisholm, who also happened to be an MI6 officer operating under diplomatic cover. On the surface, Janet was exactly what she appeared to be: a well-bred Englishwoman navigating the peculiar isolation of expatriate life in the Soviet capital. But beneath that surface, she was something else entirely. She was a courier, a cutout, a vital link in the chain that connected Oleg Penkovsky to the West. And she performed her role with a coolness that would have impressed professionals with decades of training. The meetings followed a careful choreography. Penkovsky would appear in the park seemingly by chance, nodding politely as he passed the young mother with her pram. A brief exchange of pleasantries, a moment when their paths crossed just closely enough for hands to brush against the carriage. And then it was done. Film canisters containing photographed documents slipped beneath the blankets where Janet's baby lay sleeping, transferred in seconds while KGB surveillance teams supposedly watched from a distance. The image is almost domestic in its ordinariness: a woman, a child, a stroll through a public park, yet it conceals a transaction that could have meant death for everyone involved. How many times did Janet Chisholm make that walk, knowing what lay hidden beneath her infant's blankets? The question that gnaws at researchers is not whether Janet was brave. Her courage is beyond dispute. The question is how she survived. The KGB maintained extensive surveillance networks throughout Moscow, and diplomatic personnel were watched with particular intensity. British embassy staff were assumed to be intelligence officers until proven otherwise, and even then, the assumption rarely changed. Rory Chisholm was almost certainly identified as MI6 within weeks of his arrival. His wife would have been monitored as a matter of routine. Yet somehow, Janet's meetings with Penkovsky continued for months without apparent detection. She was never arrested, never interrogated, never expelled from the Soviet Union in disgrace. When Penkovsky was finally taken, Janet and her family quietly departed Moscow and returned to England, where she lived out her days in careful silence. Some explanations are innocent enough. Perhaps the KGB was simply less competent than its fearsome reputation suggested. Perhaps Janet's tradecraft was so flawless that even experienced watchers failed to notice the exchanges. Perhaps the surveillance teams assigned to diplomatic wives were stretched thin, distracted by higher priority targets. These explanations satisfy some historians, but others find them inadequate. The KGB that emerged from Stalin's terror was not an organization known for sloppiness.
and Penkovsky was not a minor target. If counterintelligence officers suspected a mole in the GRU, they would have watched everyone connected to him with obsessive attention. The idea that Janet Chisholm slipped through that net by luck alone strains credibility. A darker interpretation has circulated among researchers willing to venture into speculation. What if Janet was noticed? What if the KGB observed her meetings with Penkovsky and chose not to intervene, not because they missed the significance, but because allowing the channel to remain open served their purposes? If Soviet intelligence had already identified Penkovsky as a traitor, they might have seen value in letting him continue. Every document he passed to Janet was a document they could track, a piece of information whose impact they could measure and potentially manipulate. In this reading, Janet Chisholm was not a spy who evaded detection, but a pawn in a game whose true dimensions neither she nor her handlers ever understood. The Soviets would sacrifice Penkovsky when the time was right, but the British woman and her baby carriage could go free. Her survival was not luck. It was permission. Janet Chisholm never spoke publicly about her role in the Penkovsky operation. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, offered no explanations for the questions that swirled around her involvement. She died in 2004, taking her secrets with her into silence. Perhaps she had been sworn to secrecy by MI6 and honored that oath until her final breath. Perhaps she simply wished to protect her family from the shadows of a past that could still reach out to harm them. Or perhaps she knew things that no one, not the British, not the Russians, not the historians who picked through the wreckage of the Cold War, wanted brought into the light. Her silence speaks volumes, but in a language that no one has yet learned to translate. The timing haunts the imagination like a recurring nightmare. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy appeared on American television screens to deliver the most terrifying address of the nuclear age. Soviet missiles in Cuba. A naval quarantine. The possibility of war measured not in months or years, but in hours. Across the Atlantic, in living rooms throughout Europe, families gathered around their radios and wondered if the world would survive the week. And at that precise moment, as Kennedy's words crackled through the airwaves, KGB officers in Moscow were placing Oleg Penkovsky under arrest. The man whose intelligence had helped America understand the crisis was being dragged into the darkness just as that crisis reached its peak. Coincidence is a comfortable word. It allows us to believe that events unfold randomly, that the universe does not arrange its cruelties with theatrical precision. But the arrest of Penkovsky on the same night as Kennedy's address strains the very concept of coincidence to its breaking point. The KGB did not operate impulsively. Arrests of this magnitude required planning, authorization from the highest levels, coordination among multiple departments. Someone had chosen this specific moment to end Penkovsky's operation, and the choice cannot have been accidental. Was it a message to Washington? A demonstration that Moscow knew exactly who had been feeding American intelligence? Or was it something else, a move in a game whose rules have never been fully disclosed? The arrest itself was swift and efficient. Penkovsky was seized at his apartment,
the hidden cameras and microfilm canisters discovered during a search that suggested the KGB knew exactly what they were looking for. Within hours, he had been transported to Lubyanka prison, that grim fortress in the heart of Moscow where so many enemies of the state had disappeared over the decades. The interrogations began immediately. What happened in those underground rooms remains a matter of dispute, with competing narratives that serve competing interests. Soviet accounts, released years later, portrayed Penkovsky as defiant to the end. A traitor, yes, but one who faced his captors with the dignity of a man who believed in what he had done. He gave nothing away, these accounts suggested. He protected his sources and his methods even under extreme pressure. Western intelligence received a very different picture. According to reports that filtered back through defectors and intercepted communications, Penkovsky broke quickly under interrogation. He revealed operational details, identified contacts, and compromised methods that the CIA and MI6 had spent years developing. Assets in Eastern Europe were hastily extracted or went silent. Networks that had taken a decade to build were dismantled overnight. If these reports were accurate, then Penkovsky's final contribution to the Cold War was not heroism, but catastrophe, a hemorrhage of secrets flowing in the opposite direction from west to east, as devastating as anything he had originally provided. But which version is true? And more troublingly, which version were we meant to believe? The Soviets had reasons to portray Penkovsky as unbroken. A defiant traitor made for better propaganda than a whimpering coward, and the image of an enemy who remained strong even in defeat reflected well on the system that had produced him. Western intelligence, meanwhile, had reasons of its own to exaggerate the damage Penkovsky had caused under interrogation. Admitting that a prized asset had revealed everything would justify the rapid closure of operations, the reassignment of personnel, and the burial of files that might otherwise have faced uncomfortable scrutiny. In the wilderness of mirrors that defines espionage, even the story of a man's destruction becomes a tool to be manipulated. 3 weeks after Penkovsky's arrest, Greville Wynne was seized in Budapest. The British businessman had continued his travels through Eastern Europe despite warnings from MI6 that the operation had been compromised. Perhaps he believed his cover remained intact. Perhaps he was simply unable to abandon the life of excitement and purpose that espionage had given him. Whatever his reasoning, it proved fatal to his freedom. Hungarian security forces, acting on Soviet instructions, arrested Wynne on November 2nd and transported him to Moscow to face charges alongside the colonel he had served. 2 men from opposite ends of the Cold War divide, bound together by secrets they had shared and now by the cells that held them. The trap had closed on both of them, and the only question remaining was what price they would be forced to pay. The courtroom was a stage, and everyone present understood their roles. In May of 1963, Soviet cameras captured the trial of Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne in the military collegium of the Supreme Court, broadcasting images of socialist justice to audiences around the world. The setting was deliberately grand, designed to convey the weight and authority of the state. Uniformed judges sat behind an elevated bench. Prosecutors delivered their accusations with theatrical gravity. And in the defendant's dock, 2 men who had once moved through shadows now stood exposed beneath blinding lights, their fates already sealed by decisions made long before the first witness was called.
Penkovsky appeared transformed. The confident colonel who had photographed secrets in his apartment and passed microfilm through dead drops was gone, replaced by a hollow figure who recited his confessions with mechanical precision. Yes, he had betrayed the motherland. Yes, he had sold secrets to the imperialist enemy. Yes, he deserved the ultimate punishment for his crimes. The words flowed smoothly, too smoothly, as if he had rehearsed them hundreds of times in the months since his arrest. His eyes, captured in grainy footage that still exists in archives today, seemed focused on something beyond the courtroom, or perhaps on nothing at all. Whatever the KGB had done to him during those months in Lubyanka, it had left behind only the shell of the man who had once dreamed of changing the world. Greville Wynne played a different part entirely. The British businessman maintained his innocence with a stoicism that bordered on defiance, insisting that he had been an unwitting pawn in a game he never understood. His performance was less polished than Penkovsky's, more human in its flashes of indignation and bewilderment. Whether this was genuine emotion or careful calculation remains impossible to determine. Wynne knew the verdict was predetermined, knew that nothing he said would alter his sentence, but he seemed determined to leave a record that would outlast the courtroom. He was not a spy, he declared. He was a businessman who had been used and discarded by forces beyond his control. The judges listened impassively, their expressions betraying nothing. But for those who watched the trial closely, certain details refused to fit the official narrative. Penkovsky's confession contained specific information about Western intelligence methods and personnel, yet it conspicuously omitted other details that the Soviets should have been eager to expose. Names that should have been named went unmentioned. Operations that Penkovsky had certainly known about were passed over in silence. The confession felt edited, curated, as though someone had decided precisely what would be revealed and what would remain hidden. Was this simply the result of Soviet prosecutors shaping the narrative for propaganda purposes? Or was something more subtle at work, a final communication encoded in the gaps between Penkovsky's words? Some researchers have suggested that the trial itself was a form of message, a signal passed between intelligence services using the condemned colonel as their unwilling medium. In this interpretation, the Soviets used Penkovsky's confession to tell the West exactly what they knew and, equally importantly, what they wanted the West to believe they knew. The omissions were deliberate, designed to protect sources or operations that remained valuable even after Penkovsky's arrest. The revelations were calculated, intended to sow doubt and confusion among CIA and MI6 officers who would parse every syllable for hidden meaning. If true, then the trial was not merely theater, but tradecraft, a final operation conducted in plain sight before a global audience that understood nothing of its true purpose. The verdicts surprised no one. Penkovsky was sentenced to death. Wynne received 8 years in a Soviet prison, a punishment calibrated to maximize diplomatic leverage while stopping short of provoking outright confrontation with Britain. The cameras recorded the moment when the sentences were announced, capturing Wynne's carefully composed expression and Penkovsky's vacant stare. Within days, the foreign journalists would file their stories and move on to other crises. The courtroom would return to its ordinary functions, and Oleg Penkovsky would disappear into the machinery of Soviet justice
leaving behind only questions that the official record was never designed to answer. What had he truly revealed under interrogation? What secrets had he carried to his grave? And whose script had he been reading from when he stood before those cameras and confessed to betraying everything he once believed? May 16th, 1963. According to official Soviet records, Oleg Penkovsky was executed by firing squad on this date, his life ending in a courtyard or basement somewhere in Moscow, his body disposed of through channels that left no trace for history to follow. The paperwork was filed, the case was closed, and the state moved on to other enemies. It is a clean narrative, administratively tidy, precisely the kind of ending that bureaucracies prefer. But the official record has never been the only version of this story, and in the decades since Penkovsky's death, if death it was, darker rumors have refused to fade. They circulate still, whispered among researchers and former intelligence officers, each one more disturbing than the last. The most persistent rumor describes a punishment that defies imagination. According to accounts that surfaced through defectors and unofficial channels, Penkovsky was not granted the relative mercy of a bullet. Instead, he was taken to a crematorium while still alive and conscious, strapped to a stretcher, and fed slowly into the furnace. The story claims this method was reserved for traitors of exceptional magnitude, a medieval horror preserved within the modern Soviet state for those whose betrayals demanded something beyond ordinary execution. Whether this account is true cannot be determined. No documentary evidence has ever emerged to confirm it, and the sources who first reported it had their own reasons for spreading tales that painted the KGB in the darkest possible colors. Yet the rumor persists, repeated in books and documentaries, impossible to verify and equally impossible to dismiss. Other accounts suggest a different kind of deception. Some researchers have noted that the man who appeared in the courtroom during the May trial seemed somehow diminished, not merely broken by interrogation, but physically altered in ways that photographs from earlier years do not explain. This has led to speculation that Penkovsky was executed long before his trial ever began, perhaps within days of his arrest, before he could reveal anything of value under interrogation. The figure who confessed before the cameras in this interpretation was not Penkovsky at all, but a double, a trained actor reciting lines that served Soviet purposes while the real colonel had already been silenced forever. It is a theory that sounds like paranoid fantasy, yet the intelligence world has documented cases of such substitutions before. In a system built on deception, even death can be staged. And then there is the third possibility, perhaps the most unsettling of all. What if Penkovsky was never executed? The colonel possessed an extraordinary depth of knowledge about Western intelligence methods, personnel, and operations. He had met with CIA and MI6 officers dozens of times, learning details that would have taken years to extract through other means. A man with such knowledge was valuable, far too valuable, some argue, to simply destroy. According to this theory, the Soviets announced Penkovsky's execution while secretly keeping him alive in some hidden facility, continuing to interrogate him for months or even years afterward. Every scrap of information he possessed about Western operations would have been methodically extracted analyzed, and exploited. His death certificate would have been a lie, a convenient fiction that allowed the KGB to work on him indefinitely without interference. None of these stories can be confirmed. The Soviet archives that might contain the truth remain sealed or have been conveniently lost. The witnesses who might have spoken are dead or silent. What remains is ambiguity so profound that it begins to feel deliberate, as though someone long ago decided that the circumstances of Penkovsky's end should never be definitively known. Uncertainty, after all, has its own utility. A traitor whose fate remains mysterious serves as a more effective warning than one whose death is documented and understood. The imagination conjures horrors far worse than any official report could describe. Perhaps that was always the intention. What we are left with is a man who disappeared into a system designed to erase inconvenient truths. Oleg Penkovsky, who had risked everything to prevent a nuclear war, who had photographed secrets in his apartment and passed them through baby carriages in Moscow parks, who had stood at the center of the most dangerous moment in human history, this man simply vanished. The official record offers a date and a method, but the official record has lied before. The rumors offer alternatives, each more terrible than the last, but rumors are not evidence. Somewhere in the silence between these competing narratives lies the truth of how Oleg Penkovsky met his end. And somewhere, perhaps, that truth is still being guarded by those who decided long ago that some secrets must never see the light. The archive is a battlefield where the dead continue to fight. In the decades following Penkovsky's execution, or disappearance, depending on which story you believe, researchers began the painstaking work of reconstructing his story from official records. What they discovered was not merely incomplete documentation, but something far more troubling. A pattern of absence so consistent that it could only be deliberate. Files that should have existed had vanished. Documents that had been declassified were quietly reclassified, withdrawn from public access without explanation. Witnesses who had once spoken freely to journalists and historians suddenly declined further interviews, their silence arriving like a coordinated signal from somewhere beyond their control. In 1965, the CIA released a carefully curated version of the intelligence Penkovsky had provided, published under the title that suggested transparency while delivering something far more selective. The documents revealed enough to confirm Penkovsky's extraordinary contribution: the missile specifications, the strategic assessments, the organizational charts of Soviet intelligence, but they omitted anything that might expose how American analysts had used this information or what operations had been launched on its basis. The gaps were surgical, precise, clearly the work of editors who understood exactly what needed to remain hidden. Researchers who requested the original unredacted files were told they didn't exist, or that they existed but couldn't be located, or that they had been destroyed in routine archival maintenance. The explanations shifted, but the result remained constant. The complete picture would not be made available. British records proved equally elusive. The government in London maintained that certain files related to the Penkovsky operation had been lost, misplaced in the labyrinthine storage facilities where classified documents go to be forgotten. Other files were acknowledged to exist, but deemed too sensitive for release, their contents protected by exemptions that could be renewed indefinitely.
Greville Wynne's debriefings after his release from Soviet prison were partially declassified, then partially reclassified, then subjected to redactions so extensive that entire pages consisted of nothing but black bars obscuring whatever truths lay beneath. Historians who filed Freedom of Information requests received polite refusals citing national security concerns that apparently remained urgent more than half a century after the events in question. The Russian archives offered a different kind of frustration. After the Soviet collapse, Western researchers descended on Moscow, hoping to finally access the KGB files that would answer their lingering questions. What they found was a landscape of selective revelation. Certain documents were released with great ceremony: photographs of Penkovsky's arrest, fragments of interrogation transcripts, official memoranda describing the investigation that had unmasked him. These releases generated headlines and filled gaps in the historical record, but they also raised new questions that the archives seemed unwilling to answer. The documents that might explain how the Soviets first identified Penkovsky remained sealed. The files that might reveal what he confessed under interrogation were unavailable. The records that might confirm or deny the rumors about his execution had apparently never existed at all. Some researchers have suggested that the missing files point toward truths that multiple governments prefer to keep buried. Perhaps the documents would reveal that Western intelligence had been penetrated far more deeply than anyone has admitted, that Penkovsky was betrayed not by Soviet counterintelligence, but by a mole in London or Washington whose identity remains protected to this day. Perhaps they would show that the Soviets knew about Penkovsky far earlier than the official timeline suggests, that the intelligence he provided during the Cuban Missile Crisis was compromised or manipulated in ways that would rewrite our understanding of that pivotal moment. Perhaps they would expose operations or assets that remain sensitive even now, secrets whose revelation could still cause damage to living persons or ongoing activities. Or perhaps the absence itself is the message. In the world of intelligence, what is hidden often matters more than what is revealed. The persistent gaps in the Penkovsky record may be designed to maintain uncertainty, to prevent any definitive account from emerging, to ensure that the true story remains forever contested. Ambiguity serves power. A narrative that cannot be confirmed cannot be used as a weapon. By keeping the files locked away, the agencies that once ran Penkovsky and the agencies that once hunted him maintain control over a story that might otherwise escape their grasp. The archive remains a battlefield, and the dead colonel is still fighting a war whose objectives have never been fully disclosed. Step back from the shadows for a moment. Set aside the mysteries, the contradictions, the files that vanished, and the witnesses who fell silent. Forget the rumors of crematorium furnaces and body doubles and moles buried deep within Western intelligence. Strip away everything that cannot be proven, every speculation that has fueled decades of debate, and ask a simpler question. What do we know for certain about what Oleg Penkovsky accomplished? The answer, even in its most conservative form, is staggering. This one man, working alone in his Moscow apartment with a camera the size of a lighter, helped prevent the annihilation of human civilization.
The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. For nearly 2 weeks in October of 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of a war that would have killed hundreds of millions of people within hours of its beginning. The missiles in Cuba were real. The nuclear warheads were real. The possibility that a miscalculation or miscommunication could trigger apocalypse was not theoretical, but immediate, pressing against every decision made in Washington and Moscow like a weight that threatened to crush the world. In those 13 days, President Kennedy and his advisors made choices that would determine whether humanity had a future. And they made those choices with knowledge that came, in substantial part, from the documents Oleg Penkovsky had risked his life to deliver. The technical manuals he photographed told American analysts exactly what they were seeing in the U-2 photographs from Cuba. Without those manuals, the grainy images of missile installations would have been subject to interpretation, debate, and potentially catastrophic misunderstanding. Analysts might have overestimated Soviet readiness, concluding that the missiles were already operational when they were not, pushing Kennedy toward a preemptive strike that would have guaranteed war. Or they might have underestimated the threat, allowing Khrushchev additional time to complete installations that would have fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Instead, American intelligence knew precisely what stage of assembly each missile site had reached. They knew how many days remained before the weapons became operational. They knew, with a certainty that no satellite photograph could provide, exactly what they were facing. But Penkovsky's contribution extended beyond technical specifications. The documents he provided revealed something equally crucial, that Khrushchev was bluffing. Soviet propaganda had long claimed strategic superiority, suggesting that Moscow possessed nuclear capabilities far exceeding anything the Americans could match. This perception shaped Western policy, encouraged Soviet adventurism, and created a climate of fear that made rational negotiation nearly impossible. Penkovsky's intelligence demolished the myth. The Soviet arsenal was smaller, less sophisticated, and less ready than Khrushchev wanted the world to believe. Kennedy entered the crisis knowing that his adversary was playing a weak hand with extraordinary boldness. That knowledge gave him room to negotiate, to offer face-saving compromises, to find a path back from the brink that both sides could accept. Millions of lives were saved. The phrase is easy to write, difficult to comprehend. Try to imagine the cities that would have burned: Moscow, Washington, London, Leningrad, New York, Kiev, reduced to radioactive ash within minutes of the first exchange. Try to imagine the fallout spreading across continents, the crops withering, the water poisoned, the slow death of survivors envying those who had perished instantly. This was not fantasy, but genuine possibility, a future that nearly arrived in October of 1962. And it was averted in part because a Soviet colonel decided that loyalty to humanity mattered more than loyalty to any flag. He made that choice knowing it would likely cost him everything. He made it anyway. Whatever questions remain about Penkovsky, his motives, his psychology, the true circumstances of his death, this much cannot be disputed. The information he passed through hotel rooms and park benches, through dead drops and baby carriages, through the hands of diplomats' wives and nervous British businessmen, that information changed the course of history. It gave decision-makers the knowledge they needed to step back from catastrophe. It revealed the truth behind the propaganda and the bluster, exposing the real balance of power at the moment when such knowledge mattered most. Oleg Penkovsky betrayed his country, and in doing so, he may have saved the world. The ledger of history contains few entries of comparable weight. Whatever darkness surrounds his story, this light remains. The question that remains is the one we started with. Why? Why did Oleg Penkovsky, a decorated Soviet colonel with a promising career, a family, a life built within the system that had shaped him from childhood, why did he choose to betray everything? The explanations offered over the decades feel incomplete, each one capturing a fragment of truth while leaving the larger mystery intact. Ideology? Penkovsky never articulated a coherent political philosophy, never spoke of converting to Western values or rejecting communist principles with the fervor of a true believer. Resentment? His career had stalled, certainly, blocked by the stain of his father's White Army service, but many officers faced similar obstacles without becoming traitors. Money? The sums he received were modest, nowhere near enough to justify the risks he took. Some who studied him closely have suggested that Penkovsky was driven by something harder to name, a conviction that the system he served was leading the world toward destruction and that he alone occupied a position where he might do something to stop it. He had seen the Soviet military from the inside, understood its capabilities and its limitations, watched as Khrushchev bluffed and blustered about weapons that existed more in propaganda than in reality. Perhaps he recognized that this bluff could not continue forever, that eventually someone would call it, and that when that moment came, the result would be catastrophe. Perhaps he believed that by revealing the truth to the West, he could restore a balance of understanding that might prevent the final miscalculation. If so, his betrayal was not an act of treachery, but of desperate salvation. Others have proposed darker interpretations. Perhaps Penkovsky was manipulated from the beginning, a pawn in a game whose true dimensions he never understood. Perhaps forces within Soviet intelligence identified him early, recognized his vulnerabilities, and used him to feed the West a carefully constructed mixture of truth and disinformation. Perhaps his entire operation was a Soviet creation, designed to shape American perceptions at a moment when such shaping could yield strategic advantage. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but troubling. The convenient timing of his discovery, the peculiar gaps in his confessions, the files that remain sealed in archives on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. If true, then Penkovsky was not a hero, but a victim, and the story we have been telling requires fundamental revision. The truth, most likely, lies somewhere in the space between these interpretations, too complicated for simple narratives, too human for clean categories of heroism or villainy. Oleg Penkovsky was a man shaped by extraordinary circumstances, living through an era when the decisions of individuals could determine whether civilization survived or perished. He made choices that reflected his own psychology, his own grievances, his own vision of what the world needed. Those choices had consequences that rippled outward across history, touching lives that would never know his name. Whether he acted from principle or resentment, from courage or manipulation, the effect was the same. The intelligence he provided helped prevent a war that would have ended everything. We are left, finally, with absence. The man himself is gone, erased by an execution whose details remain disputed, buried in archives that refuse to yield their secrets. The witnesses who might have explained his motivations are dead. The documents that might have answered our questions have vanished or remain locked away. What survives is the outline of a story, the shape of a life lived in shadows, the echo of choices made in hotel rooms and prison cells more than 60 years ago. We cannot know Oleg Penkovsky completely. We can only trace the edges of the mystery he left behind and wonder at the courage, or the desperation, or the madness that drove him to change the world. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself the most fitting memorial. Penkovsky lived his double life in the space between truth and deception, serving masters on both sides of a divided world, trusting no one with the complete picture of who he was or what he intended. It seems appropriate that his story should resist final resolution, that the questions surrounding him should persist as long as anyone remembers his name. He was a ghost in the shadows during his lifetime, and a ghost he remains, haunting the archives, the histories, the imaginations of all who try to understand what he did and why. The files may never be opened. The truth may never be known. But the world that Oleg Penkovsky helped to save continues, and in that continuation, something of him endures. History rarely offers clean endings, and the story of the colonel who stepped out of the shadows to change the course of the Cold War is no exception. Yet perhaps there is meaning in the incompleteness itself. We remember Penkovsky not because we understand him, but because his actions mattered, because somewhere in the chaos of espionage and betrayal, courage and calculation, a single man made a difference that outlasted his own mysterious fate. That is enough. That has to be enough. The shadows keep their secrets, but the world keeps turning. And somewhere in the silence between what we know and what we will never learn, the ghost of Oleg Penkovsky watches still. If this story moved you, there are others waiting to be discovered. More hidden histories, more secrets that shape the world we live in today. Explore them. And I would be grateful if you shared your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe drove Penkovsky to his impossible choice? What questions still linger in your mind? Your voice matters in this conversation. And if this journey into the shadows meant something to you, a simple click on the like button helps others find their way here too. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know.